3.18 has added a lot of new content to Path of Exile, be it Sentinels, Recombinators, Uber bosses, or Arch Nemesis mods. And today, I'm going to be asking the question, should Sentinel go core? And if it does go core, what form might it take? Path of Exile has a lot of older, outdated mechanics. We've already seen the removal of both Prophecy and Parandus. It's entirely possible that Sentinel was designed as a replacement for Tormented Spirits. The ghosts don't really serve any purpose anymore, and their AI leads to a lot of frustration. But I don't know that Sentinel is a good replacement, because Sentinel in and of itself has some very problematic issues that were never fixed over the course of 3.18. In fact, Sentinel got remarkably few changes throughout all of 3.18, despite these outstanding issues. For example, when you want to empower enemies with a Sentinel, you want the Sentinel to actually cast its beam and buff the enemies, but you also want to kill the enemies as quickly as possible, since there's nothing more dangerous in Path of Exile than a screen full of enemies, except for maybe a screen full of dead enemies, all triggering their on-death effects. And this is the first problem that I have with Sentinel. It has a delay, and if you don't build it for cast speed, it feels pretty bad to use. The better your build gets, the worse this feels. You're more likely to obliterate the entire screen before a single enemy gets buffed. And in fact, I've had to be careful of my Tempest shield doing this. That's right, my build has gotten to the point where a passive aura buff on me, that I'm not intentionally scaling in any way, is able to sometimes kill enemies before the Sentinels can buff them. To further complicate things, Sentinels are consumables. They get used up over time, and while the system of making new ones was pretty fun at first, long term, I think it's going to get very tedious. Sentinel feels like it's a few balance patches short of being good. The issues are fixable, but they haven't been fixed, which leads me to believe that Sentinel is not fated to go core, and GGG has already cut their losses. In some ways, this is a good thing, because the reward structure of Sentinel is innately problematic. However, Recombinators are the best thing to ever happen to the Path of Exile economy. Now, I'll be talking more about Recombinators later in this video. But for now, let's assume that Recombinators can go core without Sentinels themselves going core. So why are the rewards from Sentinels so problematic? Because Sentinel is incredibly rewarding, and it gives you rewards from other leagues, which means Sentinel can act as a replacement for something like Delve or Metamorph. It won't give you quite everything, but it will give you the things that people most commonly value. This is an issue because of how items are valued in Path of Exile. Items have value because people want them. The more people want of an item, the greater the demand, thus the price goes up. The more people farm the item, the more the supply, thus the price goes down. Sentinels have a greater impact on the supply for a lot of items than the actual mechanics that are supposed to give them. Thus, it devalues farming those mechanics. You don't want to farm Metamorph because you could just use a Metamorph Sentinel instead. And deal with the fact that it's a somewhat complex mechanic that often requires specialized choices in your builds, when you could just use a Fossil Sentinel, and within a couple maps get, well, more fossils than you'd actually get from delving, minus certain specific drops. In other words, Sentinel's loot is problematic because it can act as a replacement for other mechanics, especially when it comes to consumable rewards. And this is made worse by the fact that Sentinel itself is also just very rewarding in terms of things like raw currency drops. Putting rewards aside though, Sentinel doesn't integrate very well into PoE. I mean, you just have this robot following you around buffing stuff. If you want to use a Pandemonium Sentinel, you need to use it near as many enemies as possible. You then need it to empower the massive clump of enemies, and then you kill everything. You're leaving a lot of enemies alive for a greater period of time, thus risking your own death or forcing you to build an incredibly tanky character, which honestly isn't that easy to do on a budget. And herein lies another problem. It's worth waiting. It's worth buffing things, and it's worth surviving the dangers. Sentinel is incredibly rewarding, but it feels bad to use. You're sitting there not attacking, and it feels like a very harsh artificial gate. If I was just attacking, the enemies on my screen would be long dead before the Sentinel ever went off. The other types of Sentinels are also problematic, especially if you don't invest any Sentinel points into them. They work really well overall in things like Expedition or Incursion, but don't synergize with Blight and can be problematic in Delirium. I'm sure this could be ironed out with a few patches, but as it is, it feels bad, and those patches simply haven't come. Finally, the Sentinel controller itself doesn't feel like it has a purpose. Most players set up their optimal Sentinel tree early on, and then ignored the controller for the next 2 months. There's relatively little reason to swap around your tree, unless you're switching up the main Sentinel that you plan to use. And this whole system feels like tedium rather than something that enhances your gameplay, especially since you can't fix a series of points into a build and say that you have to reallocate it time and time again, which discourages players from switching a lot. Finally, the very fact that GGG has not fixed these issues makes me think that Sentinel won't be going core, but instead, some parts of the mechanic will be lifted or adapted into future design. But this leaves a very important question. What's going to happen to Recombinators? Before I get to that, we're a few minutes into the video, and you're still here. So if you've been enjoying the content and aren't in the middle of typing a Reddit-esque rage comment, be sure to leave a like, as that really helps me out, and it tells YouTube to show the video to more people. If you've been enjoying this, you might enjoy some of my other content, such as when I talk about the build that I'm playing right now. For that, be sure to get subscribed and ring the bell to be notified whenever I upload. After you're done with this video, if you want more content, then there's plenty of videos on my channel, and on my second channel, 10 Gaming Thoughts, where I talk about a variety of general gaming topics. If you want to check that out, you can do so by clicking through the card. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members for their continued support, but a little more about that at the end. For now, let's get into Recombinators and why I think they're the best thing to happen to the PoE economy, well, pretty much ever. Recombinators are great. They actively encourage people to destroy items, and they can be used to make very simple gear or incredibly powerful complex gear. This means that high item level bases are a lot more valuable. This means if an item drops on the floor with a single good mod, like +1 to level of all skill gems, tier 1 spell suppression, or 35% move speed, it actually has value, and people will look to buy it. GGG has been trying to make items off the floor more valuable for a very long time. The softcore trade economy always starts out really awesome, but over time, items pile up and no one wants them, so they lose their value. This leads to stagnation and overall makes the economy feel very sluggish. GGG has tried to improve this in various ways. First, they made Valorbs to try to encourage players to destroy their own items. But this was pretty clunky and not that rewarding, so players didn't do it too often. They then added the double corruption chamber, which was very rewarding. But again, you could only get so many temples, so not that many players engaged with it. Players saw this as high risk with relatively low reward, or just very difficult to obtain. So usually, people either destroyed relatively common unique items, or gambled the best of the best, things like a headhunter. Synthesis put an interesting twist on this, dropping fractured bases and encouraging you to synthesize 3 of them into a new item. This did encourage people to destroy items, but it didn't work on normal stuff off the ground. Similarly, an Awakener's Orb allows you to destroy an influence base to transfer one mod over to a new base, and apply both influences to that base. This again, though, only applies to influenced items. Enter Scourge, where you could Krangle an item up to 3 times, corrupting it and giving it new implicits, one of which was an upside, the other of which was a downside. Unfortunately, this system players absolutely hated. Objectively speaking, it was very rewarding. Any time that you could afford to replace an item, odds are you probably wanted to Krangle it because it would be very unlikely to completely destroy it, and you'd probably add some value there. But the odds of getting an absolutely amazing win were also pretty low, so many people felt it was too unrewarding and completely ignored the system. GGG definitely took some inspiration from the successful aspects of all these previous systems when making Recombinators. Recombinators combine 2 items, generating a new item on one of the base types with an averaged item level, and then putting all the prefixes and suffixes into individual pools and assigning them to the new item randomly. This means that Recombinators are very good at making early game items, mid game items, and even high-end items. The more you invest into them, the better your results. It's relatively easy to make yourself a great pair of boots by combining just a couple of good affixes. You could use essences on a couple Imperial Claws, smash them together, and get a great starting weapon. Of course, if you want to make a best-in-slot item, you can get 3 times tier 1 or 3 essence prefixes, and maybe add in some crit chance, crit multi, or essence attack speed for your suffixes. This will require a lot more Recombinators, but it yields a much better item as a result. This shows that they can work great for creating a basic starter item, but can also be scaled into the endgame. In the first case, you'll destroy 4 or 5 bases and use a few essences. In the case of an endgame item with, say, 3 or 4 essence mods, you're going to be using 100 bases and plenty of essences, maybe even a few exalts for meta crafting. This sort of crafting is why high item level bases have held their value in 3.18. It's also why a lot of consumables like essence are worth more than previously. You, as a high-end crafter, might be using less essences on an individual item than you did in the past, but a lot more people are crafting, which means a lot more essences are getting used on a lot more items. For the first time in a very long time, items on the ground actually have value, which is why the Cloak of Tamwir Isley is such a valuable item and basically a money printer in 3.18. The economy is the healthiest I can remember in a long time, possibly ever. In light of that, I expect that Recombinators are here to stay. They bring a lot of really positive things to the economy, and most importantly, they encourage people to destroy their items. It's a great way to craft decent items. It adds value to items on the ground, and you can even use them to craft some of the best endgame gear Path of Exile has ever seen. But speaking of that gear, there are some very high-end abuse cases. Right now, Recombinators ignore base-specific rules, so you can transfer ES onto armor or suppression onto ES, ignoring the limits normally imposed. You can also transfer fractured modifiers to a new base, or transfer multiple fractured mods to the same base. Yes, this does add value to the game by destroying fractured items, but what happens when you take this to a most perfectly balanced extreme with absolutely no exploits? Well, you can recombinate corrupted items and mirrored items. This means you might want to fracture a legacy mod, then mirror that fractured item, then recombinate the mirrored base to make a multiple fractured legacy item, and then roll it with some essence mods or other game-breaking nonsense. Now maybe it's fine for this to exist in standard. Maybe this is just how the top end of mirror items are going to be until something new and more powerful comes along. But it would also be very easy for GGG to nerf the top-end abuse cases without negatively impacting the average. Recombinators could be changed so that if you recombinate an item, if either of the two base items are corrupted or mirrored, the final result is also always corrupted or mirrored. You could still make that insane item with all those legacy mods, but you wouldn't be able to mirror it and copy it further, so people would be spending more and more money for very little actual return. Similarly, it would be very easy to prevent abuse cases where multiple fractured modifiers are merged onto a single base. You could just tie a fractured mod to the base item, similar to how synthesized items work. This means that it would be a straight 50-50 as to whether or not your new item had a fracture on it, and you'd be unable to make multi-fractured bases. Unless, of course, you're combining legacy multi-fractured bases to begin with. These changes would remove most of the top-end abuse cases without affecting the average item by all that much. I could also see some adjustments made to make it a little bit easier to transfer a single desirable mod to an item, but make it more difficult to transfer 2 or 3 prefixes or 2 or 3 suffixes to a single item. In totality, Recombinators have been great for the economy despite their abuse cases, and I don't think the abuse cases really affect the average player by all that much, which doesn't mean they should be ignored. Recombinators have pushed people to craft far more than they have in the past, and they've made items off the ground finally worth looking at, so I hope they stay in the game. If Sentinel no longer exists, then in 3.19 Recombinators could easily be added to the core drop pool, and kept as a relatively frequent drop. But what do you think? Is this the first time that you got into crafting in Path of Exile? Did you make some insane multi-fractured Sentinel modded project just to finish your character? Or maybe you wanted to blast maps, and so you sold all your item level 83 Imperial Claws for 4C each and made way more money than you were expecting. What about Sentinels themselves? Are you still using them, or did you give up because it didn't feel like it was worth dealing with the annoyance, despite being incredibly rewarding? Or maybe it ruined your favorite content by devaluing it. And finally, do you think Sentinel should go core, or should it just be allowed to quietly fade away? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members. Your support helps keep me independent and allows me to turn down things like sketchy mobile game sponsorships. You can do so for as low as $1 a month over on Patreon. Or, if you want to support me completely for free, then you can join the community by hopping into my Discord, link below. If you want more content, check out my second channel, 10 Gaming Thoughts. It's a place that I use to review games, ramble my way through video essays, and a lot more. Or of course, you can just click the suggested video in the card right now. I hope you learned something today, and maybe I'll see you again sometime soon.